Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Hidden Harmonies podcast, episode number 3. This is going to be an awesome episode. Very excited to share some awesome music with you all. So to anyone who's new to this podcast, welcome to you all. This is a podcast where each month I will bring you an underrated composer or piece of classical music that's forgotten, that no one ever plays or hears or listens to, and I'm going to try to bring these underrated gems to life on this podcast. So it'll be every month. If I can do it more than that, I eventually will. But for now, anyway, it'll be once a month. Right now, we are on YouTube under John Paul Piano. So please subscribe there if you're on YouTube. If you're on Spotify or iHeartRadio or Amazon Music, we are under the Hidden Harmonies podcast. So follow us there. And we are also on Instagram under Hidden Harmonies podcast. So if you're on Instagram, you should follow us there as well to help get us out there a bit more. And there is a form that you can fill out, which I will put a link to in the description. If you have a piece of classical music or a composer that is underrated and you want to spread a bit more, you can fill out the form in the link down below. And who knows, maybe I will feature your suggestion on this podcast. Finally, before we get to the actual podcast, we are very close to getting to 100 subscribers on YouTube. We only need a couple more, and I'm trying to get there by April. So if you're on YouTube, please subscribe under John Paul Piano. That would mean a lot to me. And if you have any ideas of what I could do for a 100 subscriber special, comment down below and I'll choose something to do for that. So now let's get to the actual episode number 3 of the Hidden Harmonies podcast, which is your gateway to the forgotten corners of classical music. So the composer for the piece of music this month for March is Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky, who is not exactly a underrated or hidden composer himself. Like, he's quite popular, actually. His music is quite well known. But the actual piece of music that is this month's piece of music is underrated and forgotten. So before we get there, though, I would like to just tell you a bit about Tchaikovsky in case you are not too familiar with his background. He's a Russian composer who lived from 1840 to 1893. He's a composer in the Romantic era of classical music. He went to the St. Petersburg Conservatory for theory composition. He studied composition with Anton Rubinstein, who is another composer who is actually quite underrated himself. So you just might see some things pop up on this podcast from Anton Rubinstein. Tchaikovsky's name is not at all uncommon in classical music. His music has a very Russian feel to it. He uses Russian folk melodies and tunes, as well as Russian dance rhythms as well, in some of his ballets and things like that. He is part of a group of Russian composers called the Five, or also known as the Mighty Five. This group consists of Russian composers Mily Balakirev, Chezarkui, Modest Mussorgsky, Rimsky-Korsakov, and, of course, Tchaikovsky. And they are known for their sort of Russian style of composing. That's sort of why they're put together, because there are other Russian composers that are not quite as Russian sounding or who don't use quite as many Russian aspects to music, but these 5 do. So that's why he's part of the 5. He has a very, very large compositional output. Some of his more popular works include his ballets, The Nutcracker, Swan Lake. Most of his symphonies are quite popular, his 5th and 6th especially, except my personal favorite is the 4th, so if you haven't heard Tchaikovsky's 4th Symphony, you definitely should go listen to it. Other popular works from him include his piano concertos, particularly number 1, very, very famous, especially for the crashing chords at the beginning that just go up and down the piano. And his violin concerto is also one of the most popular in violin repertoire. It's quite good. Other orchestral pieces that he is known for would be his Capriccio Italian, and his 1812 Overture, which of course everyone knows, especially for the use of the cannons in the finale of that piece of music. Go listen to them. They're all very good. You won't be disappointed. Tchaikovsky is an amazing composer. So now on to the piece of music for this month. This work is a symphony, which is a hint. Start making your guesses as to what this piece is now. It is one of his symphonies, but it is not really ever performed. There are some recordings out there. It's recorded more than it's actually performed live, which is interesting. But it's very good work. And this is Tchaikovsky's Manfred Symphony. Some people, when you say Tchaikovsky's Manfred Symphony, they're like, what is that? Like, I didn't even know that Tchaikovsky wrote a symphony with this name. And it is interesting because it's not one of his numbered symphonies. With his actual numbered symphonies, he only wrote 6, but he did write this symphony sort of on the side, not among the numbered symphonies, because it's different from the numbered symphonies in a certain way, which I'll get to in a minute. But it was written after his 4th symphony and before his 5th symphony. It was written in 1886. The Manfred Symphony was. And sort of what puts this symphony distinctly apart from the rest of his symphonies is that this is a programmatic work. Programmatic meaning it tells a story through the music. So with programmatic types of music, with program music, the composer will write the music to mirror a certain story, like in text, but in music. So they'll take a story from literature or a poem or a play or something like this, and they'll write music to sort of mirror that in a way, to sort of tell a story through music, which all music does to an extent, but programmatic music takes that to a more literal level. So the Manfred Symphony is a programmatic work. It goes through the story from the poem written by Byron named Manfred, which is where the symphony gets its name. So it tells the story of Manfred, and it's the longest of his symphonies. It clocks in at about 50 minutes on average for a performance of it. And this is a very interesting quote from Tchaikovsky, which I found. He said, quote, "The symphony, the Manfred Symphony, has turned out to be huge, serious, difficult, absorbing all of my time, sometimes to utter exhaustion. But an inner voice tells me that my labor is not in vain and that this work will perhaps be the best of my symphonic works." Unquote. So he actually thought at a time that this symphony of his was the best of his symphonies, the Manfred Symphony. But later, quite often you'll see this with composers who write music, is that they'll change their mind about a certain piece of music which they initially thought was good. And this happened with Tchaikovsky's Manfred Symphony. So he thought it was really good when he was first writing it and shortly after he finished writing it. But later on in his life, he changed his mind and he wanted to actually burn the whole symphony except for, I believe, the first movement, which thankfully he never did, or else we would probably never have this great piece of music in its entirety. Now, part of the reason why this symphony is probably never really performed is that there are very mixed opinions on this symphony. Some like it, some don't. Some like parts of it and not others and things like that, which we'll get into. But I think that overall it's quite an interesting piece of music, to say the least. But I quite like it, and I think it's very underrated and should be performed more. There are a good amount of recordings of this piece of music out there, but it's not really performed live very much, which it's a shame, but it's very interesting, and I don't really know why. It could be partially because of the quite large instrumentation that it takes. It takes, woodwinds. It takes, let's see, it takes 3 flutes, 2 oboes, 2 clarinets, 3 bassoons, and then it takes, with the brass section, 4 horns, 2 cornets, 2 trumpets, 3 trombones, and a tuba, so quite a large brass section as well. The strings, typical strings, 2 sections of violins, violas, cellos, double basses. Takes 2 harps, which is more than usual in terms of harp. Typically there's only 1 harp, if any. And then percussion takes timpani, bass drum, cymbals, tam-tam, triangle, tambourine, and chimes or bells, which is a very large percussion section. And then it does take keyboard, typically played on organ in the finale, in the last movement of the piece. So it's a large instrumentation, but I don't really know if that's the reason why, or if it's just because there's such mixed opinions on it. And I've also heard that it's a hard piece to actually put together, for like the orchestra to play and for the conductor to really put together nicely where it actually all fits and flows properly. So the story behind this symphony, the story of Manfred, is mirrored in this symphony. Quite interestingly, it's an interesting story to say the least. So in the first movement of the symphony, so it's a 4-movement work, but in the first movement of the symphony, the story, or the part in the poem that he's writing the music for, Manfred is a depressed individual. He's sort of just aimlessly wandering around the mountains in the Alps, and he gets lost. But he's sort of struggling with these thoughts, with these memories. He's trying to forget his past, but these memories of past mistakes and regrets and past love and things like that sort of just keep coming back to him. and he's just wandering around aimlessly throughout the mountains. He's lost, he doesn't know where he's going, and it's mirrored quite well in the music, I think, especially just due to the very dark, dismal atmosphere that Tchaikovsky creates with the orchestra. So he creates this very sort of depressing atmosphere to the symphony. The melodies in it are very sort of oppressive and things like that, but it surges forward into this very powerful climax. If you're in listening to a recording, the part I'm talking about is going to be about at 13 minutes and 30 seconds ish. Of course, it depends on the recording, but it's such a powerful climax. It's just very the main theme comes back in full force. It's just very just raw power, very desperate, very despairing feel to it. But it's interesting because if you close your eyes and you're hearing this climax, and if you I don't say if because I know you'll listen to it. When you listen to it, you'll know just the part I'm talking about. It's at about 13 minutes in the music, in a recording. But, if you just close your eyes and you just listen, you can almost just visualize just this lonely man just wandering around in the mountains. He's lost, he's depressed, it's just very dark atmosphere to it. But Tchaikovsky writes the music in such a way where you can literally visualize these things. It's quite amazing how he does this. So that's the first movement. It's just sort of following Manfred in the mountains. He's depressed and struggling with these thoughts of his, these painful memories. The second movement is a scherzo movement, and in this movement, it is following Manfred as he sees sort of interesting imagery, but he sees a fairy appear in a rainbow that is created from the spray that's coming off of a waterfall. And how Tchaikovsky writes this movement, once again, you can visualize it. And it's part of what makes this symphony so amazing in a way, is that he just writes the music, especially with the orchestration and things like that, where you can visualize the story behind the music. Especially in this movement, I would say, is that you can, with the orchestration, especially the woodwinds, the flutes and the piccolos have these sort of scurrying, fluttering notes around and things like that. You can visualize like the wings of the fairy or the mist that's coming off of the waterfall and things like that. It's just a very light, sort of airy feel to the whole movement. It's a very colorful, light orchestration to it, very colorful, very magical feel to it overall. But the theme, and this is also part of what makes this symphony interesting, is that the main theme from the first movement comes back just a little bit at the end of this movement. It's sort of far off in the distance, but it comes back, sort of tying things together. And I'll discuss this theme more in detail in a couple of minutes. But it's very interesting because there's this certain theme in the first movement, and a certain melody that he brings back throughout all the movements of the symphony, tying it together. And I think there's a certain reason for that, but I'll get to that in a minute. The third movement, the slow movement, the andante movement, is sort of a reprieve from this dismal mood to the symphony. It's sort of a pastoral in many ways. So in this point in the story, which Tchaikovsky is mirroring, Manfred is lost in the mountains, but then he comes across this village with these simple but poor people living in the mountains. And this movement is sort of like a picture of the lives of these mountain people. It's interesting because he sort of creates this slight reprieve from the dismal atmosphere that most of the symphony has, but he sort of, with this third movement, sort of gives you a slight reprieve to that. It's very melodic, very beautiful melodies, very, very beautiful passages. But yet that, once again, that doesn't last for long because this feeling of unrest comes back later on in the movement. And the theme from the first movement once again comes back, but then the beautiful melodies of this third movement sort of return and the movement ends very peacefully. So the fourth movement, the last movement, is typically the most controversial of the whole symphony because people say, well, it feels sort of fragmented, disjointed. It doesn't flow quite as smoothly as the rest of the symphony does. You get like these ideas sort of coming in here and there, but then, another idea comes in front of it, and it's just sort of more fragmented, I suppose is a good word for it. But I think that the reason why is because this is the most programmatic of the whole symphony, the most programmatic movement of the whole symphony, because Tchaikovsky is mirroring the story more closely than the previous movements. So in this movement, the story is that Manfred, he's wandering around lost, but then he finds himself sort of in this underground palace, this cave type of place. There's things like ghostly appearances. He sees the ghost of this lady that he once loved, and things like that sort of happen. So it's more of like a supernatural part to the story, I suppose. Ghosts and spirits and things like that. It's sort of odd. But then at the end, Manfred's past mistakes are forgiven. His mistakes are cleared off of his conscience, I suppose you could say. And then ultimately he dies. So it's an interesting end to the story and to the whole symphony. But Tchaikovsky's following this, like I mentioned, he's following this story very closely, especially in this movement. The dark mood returns from the first movement, especially. The dark mood returns in full force in this movement, along with the main themes from the first movement. So, you get these other themes that come in as well and things like that. But it's just this sort of very dismal atmosphere to this movement, especially. But then as you get towards the end of the last movement, there's this climax where the organ comes in, and it's a very majestic, very, very powerful, very stately part of this work, very stately climax where the organ comes in. And I think that probably this is the part in the story where Manfred is forgiven of his past mistakes and Manfred dies, probably, because, and then the music just sort of fades out slowly, tapers off. So this is probably where he dies. So it's a very interesting symphony, to say the least, very interesting ending as well. And yes, this movement is a bit more all over the place, if you could say. But once again, I think that's because Tchaikovsky is following the story very closely, and once again, you can visualize it. And so although people are critical of this symphony, and although I'm sure there are flaws in how it's written compared to his other symphonies and things like this, I think it's still quite worth the listen. And it's a very interesting listen, to say the least. It's very interesting to sort of, especially know the story behind it and to follow it through the music, because Tchaikovsky does this outstandingly well, where you can, if you know the story and you know the part of the story where the music is, if that makes sense, is if you just close your eyes, you can visualize just exactly what's happening in the story through the music. So it's quite amazing what Tchaikovsky does. And just to conclude, I would just like to say a couple things about this main theme that I was talking about. So the main theme in the first movement, it comes back throughout the whole symphony. So it comes back in the second, third, and fourth movements. So it's interesting because even like in the second movement, it only comes back a little bit, but it's still there. It's just like creeping in here and there throughout the whole symphony. So I think that you could almost call this like the Manfred theme, if this makes sense. And it's probably a bit silly, but this is how I think about it. Is that Manfred's lost, right? And he's wandering around, he's sort of depressed, and there's this sort of dark atmosphere to the whole piece of music, sort of this sad atmosphere, this sad mood. And this theme shows that very, very well, because especially in the climaxes of this piece of music, in the first and the last movements, I think that part of what makes this melody so powerful is that the strings have the melody itself, but then the brass is playing sort of this background ostinato, this rhythm. And then there's the timpani, which sort of gives these powerful surges, but then comes back, but then surges forward again and comes back, and things like that. So I think that the instrumentation and the orchestration is part of what makes this theme so powerful. But not only that, but it's just, if you know the story behind it, it makes it even more powerful, because you know that Manfred's lost and he's depressed and everything's just sort of compounding together. And then when you get to the climaxes of these movements, like the first movement, like I mentioned, around 13 minutes, or the last movement when it comes back, you can just feel it almost. You can almost just feel sort of just the dismal state in which Manfred's in. And so when this theme comes up, this climax, especially in the first and last movements, when you can just feel it like rising and rising and rising, and then boom, it's there with the strings playing melody out and the brass ostinato and the timpani, it's chilling. You can like feel it, you know, it's quite amazing. It's very, very powerful. When you listen to it, you'll know the parts of music I'm talking about. I told you about where it is in the first movement, but it comes back in the last movement as well. And you'll hear it creeping in the other two movements. You know, because in these movements, in the second and third, you know, Manfred is perhaps a bit more happy, I suppose you could say, you know, because like in the one movement he's seeing this fairy in the waterfall, and in the third movement he's watching the lives of these simple people living in the mountains. So, you know, his thoughts aren't perhaps quite as oppressive at the moment. But then, you know, this theme sneaks in, so then perhaps that's a part of the story where Manfred's like, "Oh, I'm lost," you know, like these thoughts sort of try to creep back in and things like that. So it's very interesting. It's quite an underrated symphony, and I think that if you listen to it, especially knowing the story behind this music, it'll make it even that much better. So definitely give it a listen. As far as recordings go, I will post links in the description to a recording that I found particularly good. I did some research, and most people were saying that this was the best recording of it that's out there. So I'll post links in the description to the recording, and definitely go take a listen to it, because it's an awesome symphony. It should be performed a whole lot more. And I know that when I'm a conductor, I will definitely put it on the program when I can. So let's listen to the first couple minutes of it, and then we'll do the conclusion. But trust me, as you listen to it, it might start out a bit interesting, where you're like, I don't really know where this is going, but trust me, it gets going. So don't shut it off within the first two minutes just because you're sort of unsure about it. You're like, this is boring or something, because it really gets going. So give it 5 minutes and you'll be sucked in. So let's listen to the first couple minutes. So thank you all for joining me for the third episode of the Hidden Harmonies podcast. I hope that little excerpt I just played for you got you interested into the symphony and that you'll go listen to the whole thing once this podcast episode is over. And links are down in the description. You'll be intrigued, trust me. So yes, go listen to this piece. If you haven't heard Tchaikovsky's other more popular works, go listen to those as well. So thank you all for watching or listening if you're on Spotify or Amazon Music or iHeartRadio. Thank you for listening as well. Please leave a like, comment what you thought of this episode and what you think of this symphony once you listen to it. Share the podcast around. Please help me spread the word about these awesome pieces of music that you don't ever hear. Fill out the form as well if you have a composer or a piece of music that you want me to feature on the podcast. And once again, please follow the podcast on all the socials that you're on, such as Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, or on Instagram as well. And please subscribe on YouTube at John Paul Piano. Help me get to 100 subscribers by April. So thank you all for joining us. This is the Hidden Harmonies podcast, which is your gateway to the forgotten corners of classical music. This is episode number 3, this month's piece being the Manfred Symphony by Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky. I'm your host, John Paul from John Paul Piano on YouTube. Thank you all for joining, and keep spreading classical music through the world.